to take advantage of your Rev 1? Would they be coming in with specific license amendments to say, I want to do Rev 1 instead of my current revision? Or are you just looking at this as moving forward in license renewal, that the next plants that come in are just going to use Rev 1? So,
yeah, and I think we're going to talk also about this later at the very end, because if Rev 0 is referenced in the current goal, then that puts us in a position where we either have to ask for relief to use Rev 1, but that's really what we're going to talk about at the end. So to answer your question directly, as we talked about on the phone, this incorporates the technical requirements, and if plants have some, for any IO 308, our desire is for the plants to use this guidance. And what we have to do is then figure out how we do that in the current regulatory framework to be able to meet what you're committed to, but also use what the current industry guidance is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And we want to be, this is, again, maybe more of an efficiency issue that we're trying to get towards here, is from a prioritization of looking at Rev 1, because if current plants right now already have requirements to address those licensee action items individually by plant, and want to take advantage of what's in Rev 1, then we need to prioritize Rev 1 to get it reviewed quickly so that we can then approve those changes. And we would like to do it in the most efficient way possible if we agree with Rev 1. I wouldn't want to put each plant going through its own licensing action if we don't need to. And then also, as you said, since it impacts license renewals, you don't want to have each license renewal coming individually and making arguments for why they should use Rev 1 instead of what's currently recognized in the goal. So I think this may be a prioritization on our part to address those issues.
And I guess, John, my thinking is, as this comes in, the old licensee action items, there'll either be a technical basis why they're not needed and they're not included, or they'll be rolled in and that'll be a mix. And then there will be implementation criteria. And I think the fastest way to do what you're talking about is, if Rev 1 is acceptable, the staff could issue interim staff guidance, which in essence incorporates it into the goal and makes it easier for the plants to update and go down that path.
But I'm going even further than that, Robin. I'm thinking of the current plants that have already received their renewed license, have Rev 0 as their licensing requirement, still have to meet it.
Right.
And we'd like to have a process, if we agree with this, that they can come in and say, oh, we want to use Rev 1 instead of Rev 0 and make that acceptable.
Right.
So do we need a formal action then to put that together to figure out how that process is going to work?
I'll take it back to the MRP and make clear what the request is and how we manage it forward.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's generic, though. I think it's a generic comment. We'll work through it in this case, but I think it applies to others as well. This may be what we just kind of talked about a little bit, but our preference would be to be able to get the approval of MRP 227 Rev 1 and not have to go back to plant-specific reviews. I think that's what we just kind of talked about. One of the items that is, I think, one of the licensee action items was the topic of coal work. And we do have a project with the PWR owners group to document generically and address the coal work all the work that we have done to review this. I think we've done about 50% of the plants have actually gone through this and not found any issues. So we do have a project to try to put that, package that into an evaluation. Okay, next topic is bottom-mounted nozzles. This has been debated for quite a while, and it really goes down to is the visual exam versus some non-visual NDE technique. And we went to the code committee and we asked them for a code case, and it's been there for about 2 years, and it reached an impasse, and in April it was voted to drop it. And we still think that there is a visual exam is effective, and that there are benefits of doing the NDE exam, but it's very limited, the NDE exam, of what the capability is. It doesn't interrogate the well. So visual is still what our analysis says is the most effective method.
I appreciate that, and we agree that the visual exam does provide an adequate level of safety. We also understand that there's certain burdens associated with the visual examination that you look at, cost and dose both. We're talking about that. And that we also understand from volumetric that you can get some further information and more proactive information. So the question is, since you're dropping this from the standpoint of the code and where you're going, are you going to continue to pursue any applications of volumetric, or are you also stopping your work in that area at this point?
First, John, I chair the task group where this is being discussed. The members voted to stop the work because you started looking at having to have a qualification program for the volumetric, how would the code case be used, and all that kind of stuff. But at the April meeting when it was voted, the staff representative said, well, I'd like to go back and think about this and give feedback. And the point of the last bullet is, we've got that on hold at ASME, waiting on the feedback from the staff, whether they agree that this is not serving their purpose, because we started this activity at the request of the staff, so that's the first feedback. And then the discussion we've had is for those plants that might want to continue and consider doing volumetric exams and get credit for that and eliminate or extend the bottom of the bare metal visual, that they could do that under a relief request, that they would do the exam and then make the argument why they could justify not doing the bare metal visual that's currently required in the regulations. So that's kind of where we see ourselves. Okay. And interested in feedback from the staff on that.
Yeah, since you're looking for feedback, I'm going to ask Bob, can you put this down as a specific action item from this meeting? Is let's have a separate meeting on this issue, and from say staff and executive standpoint, and determine what should be the next steps, because you're looking for our feedback, right. And you're on hold at this point. So. Yeah,
and the code group, they spent 2 years trying to work through it, and the complications. Some requests, for example, were to develop a PDI-like qualification program. That's $10-12 million minimum for what might be just an optional exam. So right. The cost-benefit didn't seem to be there.
Understand, appreciate that. And I think where the good part of this is we're all aligned that we do believe that visual examinations provide an adequate level of safety. So that's where we are. Again, this is looking to improve on safety. And so let's see where we go. Thanks.
Okay. My next slide just has program key takeaways. I don't think I need to expand on that. And then my final slide just gives the key contact information. Ann is the program manager. She's with EPRI. I talked about Bernie. And then Elliot Flick is the executive sponsor for the MRP.
I guess these are my two topics here, so I'll talk about these. For those on the phone, we are on slide 92 of 94, so we've gotten substantially through the package. Operational leakage, and this is one that I just kind of want to at least throw out my thinking, at the moment, and would like to maybe open some dialogue, down the road with the staff as to, how we can get there. But we have a situation where we have a number of code cases primarily focused on Class 3 piping, which gives the utility, if you have a leak in a piece of Class 3 piping, the ability to do an operability evaluation to assess that, and then schedule the repair depending on the outcome of the operability evaluation. What I would say is, I think in the industry, I don't recall ever running into a safety issue with most of these leaks, because generally speaking, in the Class 3 piping, a lot of it is either MIC-related, which is, a fairly localized area, which causes a hole in the pipe, or we get into some areas like in the Class 2 piping, especially with the smaller bore piping, socket welds, which didn't have a high level of MDE requirements associated with them, and you get a little bit of infusion or inclusion in the weld, and you get a minor hole in it. What I'd like to be able to do is to be able to do an operability evaluation regardless of the code cases, and let that stand on its own. The guidance that the NRC has put out to the inspectors is generally that, for Class 3 piping, you can fall back to generic letter 9005. And so we've got quite a bit of flexibility in that generic letter, but not so much in Class 2. In Class 2, oftentimes the problems we run into is in like the smaller bore piping, either the sampling piping or some of the connections to the steam generators, that sort of stuff. And it just seems to me from a safety perspective, since these leaks don't generally and have not been a safety issue, why wouldn't we allow the utilities to do an operability evaluation to verify there is no safety issue, and if not, continue to operate that particular system without isolating it until a repair can be scheduled, and not putting a transient on a plant unnecessarily, because anytime we challenge the operators with shutting down and starting up our plants, unless there's a safety issue, that's not something that we typically like to do. So I'd just like to throw that out and see if there's some direction we could go in updating the guidance to the inspectors in Part 9900 to give us more flexibility to do operability evaluations, even if there is not a code case, or if there's a draft code case where all the technical information's already been developed, it just hasn't been approved by NRC. Obviously, the onus would be on us to have the right technical information.
Yeah, this is definitely a topic of interest to us. As you said, you've reviewed the correspondence between NRC and ASME on this. Let me start with, I appreciate all the work ASME has done on this to this point. I think it was probably about 6 years ago, maybe, Bob, we sent a letter to ASME asking them to look at issues, and they've taken a lot of action in that area. So my thanks and kudos to them. And it included some changes that we're looking at right now to put in 5055A, as well as some code case work they did. From the standpoint of operability determinations and evaluations we have, we don't have those folks here today to talk, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I would agree with you, it is something we need to talk about more as we go forward. And I think from a general standpoint, it's looking at the consistency from a safety standpoint, and I'm talking about safety across the board, of handling it in a consistent manner of when do you find this leak. If you found it during an outage, you may handle it one way, versus if you find it during operation, you handle it a different way. So from an operability, how long does that stay? Is it okay to continue till the next outage? What if you come out of that outage, you're so close to the outage and you didn't get it repaired, right? You're a month from your outage, and they say, well, I'm not going to be able to do that during the next outage. Is it okay to come out of the outage with that leak, right? So that's another question. So there's more questions and dialogue needed on this, but I think it is something we do want to dialogue. I want to say, Brian, you signed a letter back to ASME, I want to say in the last month, 6 weeks maybe, stating that, again, we've appreciated their work, but we're going to have to look as we move forward, and maybe 9900 is where we look as our regulatory vehicle. So I'd like to keep this as an open item. Bob, you can put this down as another action item, to get back on this issue, but let's make sure we get the right people in the room.
Agreed, and I do appreciate the fact that you're willing to, entertain the discussions, because it's, we're in a pretty good spot now with Class 3, like I said, just because we've gotten so many code cases approved, but, Class 2, and then there's some nuances with Class 3, obviously, with, the Rev 2, I keep forgetting the code case that we're revving to Rev 4. Yeah, 513, Rev 4. But appreciate that. And
yeah, so as we look, and that's another part of that, is we start to talk about Manual Chapter 9900 and operability. The other piece of that is, what's then the commitment on the industry side from the standpoint of, are they following a code case? Is there some guidance document? Is there something that says, if you're following this and with respect to operability, you're here, here's what the grounds would be?
yeah, and maybe there's something that says that, if, depending on if you're going to fix it next week or next month, you go fix it. But if you're going to leave it in, if you're not going to fix it right away, then you need to come in for relief or something like that. Okay, good. Okay, next one is branch connections. Been a lot of discussion on branch connections, especially with the RIS 15-10. And the bottom line is, we recognize there's still questions out there on the less than 2-inch connections that go into the RCS, and the fact that there is a larger, hole, so to speak, in the RCS that's bigger than 2 inches, but not necessarily doesn't actually get captured by the code requirements. What we are doing right now, and I know this is another question on probabilistic fracture mechanics, but we are, from a safety perspective, looking at this to determine, because the bottom line is, we as the industry don't ever want to have a leak. We don't want to find this. We don't want to find that we've got a problem by doing a visual and saying, oops, we got a leak. So if the probabilistic fracture mechanics tells us that you really can't get there within the period of like out to 80 years or 60 years, whatever, in your current license, you wouldn't get a leak, then at that point we might say, okay, visuals are good enough. If that's not the case, if it looks like you could actually initiate and propagate a crack and get a leak within the license period, then we will be developing inspection requirements to go look at those particular connections to the RCS. And we're also developing the methodology to do the NDE, because we don't even have the NDE capabilities at this point to do that reliably.
Appreciate that. I appreciate the update. I'm glad to hear the industry's looking at this issue, as you said, for the under 2-inch. And it sounds like the path you're on from doing an analysis and looking at the probabilistic fracture mechanics may bear some fruits. I'm glad to hear that. Scheduling wise, it says when complete. Is there time frames? Not looking to hold a commitment to you, but is this something that's near term, or is this a long-term project?
Robin, do you have the time frames on this one?
The last bullet talks about a task team that is, we're looking at this at ASME, and what we decided to do was let them go look at it generically. They're working also with the plant that y'all are dealing with, is currently developing NDE criteria, has done some probabilistic work. The follow-on is the owners group, and they're hoping to report back to us at the January code meeting what the results of that probabilistic analysis would be, and then what we would do moving forward. And that's what was reported week before last in San Francisco at the code meeting. So I'm waiting on that task team to bring the answer back to our test.
So analysis by the end of the year.
That was the understanding.
Okay, great. So if that's part of that, we'll just make sure that our folks who are working on the ASME code group are aware of that, and they can report back to us.
Yeah, and that's the same task group that's handling all the nickel alloy issues.
Okay. Thanks, Rob. Appreciate that.
Okay, next topic is document reviews and revisions. Tim, were you covering this one?
We kind of touched on this when we talked about MRP 227, but what we're really wondering is if there is a alternative process that we could use from an industry standpoint and the NRC to either reduce or screen submittals to try to be able to allow us to make changes that maybe are identified in the goal or in other areas, things that we could do that would better allow us to optimize our review and approval times from the industry standpoint and the NRC. And I think there's two elements to this. One is what we talked about earlier, in that if we have a item that fits in NEI 0308 and we revise that document and it's referenced a different revision in the goal, then that puts us kind of in a box of, we want to go implement that as an industry, but it would be some type of we would have to get some type of relief. And that's what we talked about. We took the action that we'll use MRP 207 as an example. And then the other piece is just, if we have documents that we are revising and we somehow developed a screening process that says, hey, if we fit inside these screening criteria, we, the NRC, will take the document as a information only, and you can proceed on. If you don't, then we want to be in the direct review and approval process.
Thanks. So I'm going to ask Chris in a minute to speak a little bit from a license renewal perspective and a goal perspective, but let me speak from a current licensing and try to draw some analogies and where we would go. When we look at the documents we're reviewing and approving, such as an MRP 227, we're doing that and I kind of look at this in one of two ways. One is it's being reviewed as part of an SRP, and essentially that's what your call report is. It's an SRP being used to review a license renewal application, and it would be one acceptable method, right? So we would have to, if that was revised, and a revision, we're going to have to review that as well. And that can either be done on a case-specific basis, or it could be done as part of the general SRP-type document, doing that review. And then you follow those processes for where you need to go. It could also be done as part of what I'll call a topical report type process. So if we're thinking from an operating standpoint, the example I'll use here is the MRP 335 with respect to peening. That's really a topical report that's come in. People don't need to follow it. It's voluntary if they want to amend their license and peen. It says here's what they'll follow to get the relief in moving forward. So if we're following a topical report type process, we would have reviewed and approved Rev 0 of a document moving forward. But if we want to do the Rev 1, we're going to have to go back and review Rev 1. We're not going to be able to put some condition in place that says we've reviewed Rev 0 and you can make changes and you know, whether you use Rev 0, 1, 2, that's fine. We can't do that without having reviewed it. We could put a condition that says we're permitted to use MRP 235 and any revision that's approved by the NRC. So again, that would, from a licensing standpoint, allow you some flexibility. But again, it would have to be, that revision would need to be reviewed and approved by the NRC through some process in going forward. So I'm speaking from, again, the operating side. If you know, if we were to complete, and I'll use 335 as the example, if we wanted to try to put the condition with a licensee that says, yes, this relief is appropriate for you, 335, and any future revisions approved, we could look at that as an option for moving forward. And that would take some of the uncertainty, or I shouldn't say, it takes some of the licensing burden away. It keeps the same safety and it gives us certainty, but it just takes those, what I'm going to call more administrative type licensing actions, and allows you to do that. Or maybe allows you to do it as a 50-59, depending on the way it's written, so that you don't have to come back and use a later revision. But Chris, I'll let you talk about the license renewal.
Yeah, a couple points. Thanks, John. I think I agree with John and with the intent of what you're looking at. If we can minimize the burden of, if we're all in agreement of some principle of safety, can we move forward and make it there an easier way to especially if it's a positive, change for safety, get that accomplished. We're interested in it. There's some difficulties there that we have to look at. I've had some conversations with our general counsel and some others, and so we do have to be careful when we do it. ISGs is a good tool. We use those for the goal, and generically we can put that information out, and then when a submittal is made from the license renewal process, people reference the ISG. That's not all of what you're looking for, I realize. We talked about the 227 changes. I mean, obviously we can't put that in the GAL SLR until we have it in hand, so we can't, have it in hand and have time to review it, let's put it that way. So that's going to be a challenge for us in the future. So it probably will need to be something that's in the interim staff guidance framework. The difficulty with what John was talking about with 335, you got to get back to with the current licensing basis. So if you have a plant that is, let's say, licensed to Rev 0, and they want to make a change, and there's it's a positive change, and even though we've reviewed it, it could be a, change to your licensing basis. And as John referred to, that might be, maybe 5059 is able to, but if you can't deal with it in 5059 space, then, you've got to have the whole license amendment request, the process, the hearing rights, all that kind of thing comes into play. And so, while I'm not saying it can't be done, we have to look at how we do that and walk carefully through that process. So again, there's interest here in trying to make it as efficient as possible, but there are some difficulties in making that happen.
If I had to look on the operating side to step forward here, my proposal would be that as you look towards incorporating into your license one of these documents, pick whichever one it would be, in going forward, whether it's as part of a relief request or an amendment, and again, I'm staying away from license renewal for a minute, so, but if you were to do that relief request, license amendment coming forward, and it is Rev 0, I'd say that's the best place to, let's do it on that plant-specific licensing to say in parallel, because again, we'll be reviewing some of but we could work with our Office of General Counsel at that point to say we have a proposal from a specific licensee that says they would like us to incorporate this condition that says MRP XXX Rev 0 or any later revision approved by the NRC, and then we could address it at that point to see if there's any legal hurdles to move that forward.
And John, and for Chris, both of y'all, the other things just put on the table while we're talking about this. Some of the plants and some of the owners were looking at things, and this gets back more to license renewal. Let's say GAL Rev 2 references VIP 18 Rev 1, and the BWR VIP produces Rev 4. We think it's the right thing to do. It addresses OE and all the other stuff. The other question would be, since the plant made a commitment, they got their application approved, and they use the commitment process, the commitment change process that people with renewed licenses can use for other situations on a plant-specific basis. They would evaluate that document and say, based on that, I'm changing my commitment. They go down that process like they would other commitment changes they make in the renewal period after the original license has been approved. So then it becomes a vehicle that the plant can accelerate their use of that document. That was one of the things we talked about, is maybe that's a different way to address it on a plant-specific basis. I don't know what your thinking would be on that.
So you're talking about in the middle of the review for the next
Right, let me see if I can give you, let's say somebody today wanted to use Rev 4 to DIP 18.
And they're already committed.
And they've already got an approved license, and and they had committed originally in the GAL to Rev 0. You have a commitment change process that you can go through and use and say, this is why it would be okay, and this is why it would satisfy the intent, and this is why it's acceptable to make that change.